All right. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you're joining us. And welcome back to the new series of the International Macrohistory online seminar that will run through this semester until December 7th. We're starting today with a talk by Brad DeLong, who will be addressing us from his early morning in California to talk about his new book, Slouching towards Utopia, an economic history of the 20th century. Brad will tell you that the book will be available from next week. Actually, I got an advanced copy and I strongly recommend it because it's really a breathtaking history of the world economy in the 20th century. Just before I let Brad start telling you about it, let me just quickly remind you of the rules of engagement. Brad will speak for the first 40 minutes, during which we will not interrupt him except for clarification questions. If you have a clarification question, please flag it as so. If you want to submit either a clarification or a substantive question, you can type it in the Q&A. Do not do it in the chat, use the Q&A. Or you can also raise your electronic hand and I'll take note of who wants to intervene later on. So after the 40 minutes, we'll have 20 minutes initial discussion. And then after the hour, for people who want to continue the discussion, we'll have an extra 15 minutes. So that's it for me. Brad, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm extremely happy to be here virtually. The fact that we keep on running things like this makes me think there might actually be something to the idea that the plague, horrible as it was, has in fact forced technological progress, at least in the information technology sector, into a slightly faster pace, which I think would be a good thing, not a full compensation for how many million dead now, but some compensation. At any event, I'm here to talk about my forthcoming book, Slouching Towards Utopia, an economic history of the long 20th century, forthcoming on September 6th from Basic #. I oscillate between how I think about it. I oscillate between thinking it is the best work I have ever done and truly not a careerist move or a ticket punching piece for the moment, but rather a treasure for all time, and thinking that it is wholly inadequate to the subject. And the subject was to write the book I wanted to read in order to provide me, at least, for a framework for thinking about recent global economic history, which then turns into the story of the main thread of the story as to how we got here, with an eye toward understanding where we are and possibly where we might go. Why did I decide to write this book? Well, I decided to write this book because nobody else was, and because I had a rather strong feeling that people trying to write broad syntheses were doing it wrong. They were kind of writing, why is the West so rich and the rest so poor? Or they were kind of writing the story of, the development of, quote, Western, unquote, institutions and how they're much better at producing a highly productive society. And they were marking the key hinge of history at a lot of different points. They were marking it at 1770 with the coming of textile machinery and steam. They were marking it at 1688, with the Glorious Revolution. They were marking it in 1720 or so with the Enlightenment, marking it with the founding of the Royal Society, marking it with Gutenberg, marking it back to the investiture controversy, at which for the first time it becomes set in concrete that law is not just a tool, but even a constraint on the actions of the most powerful. And every time someone identified one of these as the hinges of history, people would say, wait a minute, there are predecessors. There are predecessors that are nearly indistinguishable. Going back to Hero of Alexandria using steam power to make demonstrations for his, I suppose, audition piece to become chief librarian of Alexandria. And it seemed to me that it was much better thinking of it as different components of an institutional framework coming together. And once I thought of the different components of the institutional framework that underlay modern economic growth coming together, I was more or less settled as 1870, as the hinge of history. And as the coming of modern economic growth around 1870, what Simon Kuznets called it, as in fact the key moment at which things really change, things really take off. And then there was naturally, very naturally, a book I wanted to write, given that I was starting there. And so I worked on it desultorily for, say, a decade, and then half desultorily or so for 6 or 7 years or so. And then about 5 years ago, I decided I really should start devoting some time each day to it. And then the plague came. And so lo and behold, now it is, a couple of years late. And as many of you know, and as the rest of you are going to find out, writing a book is a really hard thing. You need to have an interesting and convincing fact that holds readers' attention on every page. You also need to have enough of a forward thrust of narrative to make them turn the page. And then you have to make them happy that they are learning something, that they are taking what they are thinking and what you are saying, and they're putting it into some kind of intellectual structure of knowledge. Some kind of intellectual structure of knowledge that has to be anchored by what the French tend to call a grand narrative. And there we have the problem. We need grand narratives. We are narrative-loving creatures. We can barely think at all without them. But all grand narratives are false. All you can say is that some are useful. And as I wound up thinking, what kind of grand narrative could I use to structure the history of the world since 1870 or so, I wound up concluding that a grand narrative based on the thoughts of Karl Polanyi was the worst false, was the least false, was the least worse. But of course, it is not adequate at all, and my choice of that narrative means that even if I do manage to see some things more clearly, it means that a lot of what is happening vanishes from my field of view, completely. Let me start at the basics. Let me start with the metaphor of the economic pie. If you want to create a utopia, you have to bake a sufficiently large economic pie. Then you have to slice it equitably so that everyone has enough. Then people have to taste it, have to enjoy it, have to utilize it, have to use their wealth, their power to manipulate nature to command the attention of others and assistance of others to live lives in which they are healthy, safe, secure, and happy. Most of the non-utopian features of previous human societies had, after all, they had been a consequence of there not being enough for everyone, of population relative to resources being too high, and of the level of technology deployed and diffused being too low to make productivity anything other than under some Malthusian harrow. That there was no way there would be enough for everyone. And so to have enough for yourself then meant figuring out a way to dominate others and appropriate their work. That most of economic history, and I would argue most of history, was about how some elite managed to construct a force and fraud domination and exploitation machine and then maintain it. And it was the maintenance of that machine so the elite could have enough. And then also the jostling of the elite potential members of the elite for places in it, and also how the elite utilized the enough that they had gotten. That was the pattern of human history, with the average person in the exploited mass maybe sufficiently malnourished that they were 4 inches or so smaller than we are, with the average person sufficiently malnourished that, ovulation is likely to be a hit or miss thing for a lot of women, and children's immune systems are likely to be sufficiently compromised. And so while we know that a pre-industrial human population without nutritional stress and without artificial means of birth control, we know that such a population will quadruple roughly in a century. Back before 1500, even back before 1870, we find population growth rates of well less than, say maybe 30% per century at the most, in relatively good places. And that was the way the world was. And, that would be so, said Aristotle, and hence the chief field of economics really had to be how to boss your slaves as the most important thing to know about economics, with, raising your children, ruling your wife, and fourth and least important was knowing enough about market conditions and prices that you didn't get cheated by the metics out there who were trading things with you and knew how to allocate your slaves. The chief field of economics had to be how to boss your slaves, because we did not have, quote, the robot statues of Daedalus that were self-actuating blacksmiths, or the self-propelled catering carts of Hephaestus that brought the food into the dining room of the gods. We did not, Aristotle said, have the shuttle weaving and the plectrum touching the lyre without a hand to guide them. Well, starting in 1770, we began to. And starting in 1870, with the coming of modern economic growth, things really went into high gear. And so now we do. And if you were Aristotle, if you were Sir Francis Bacon, if you were Edward Bellamy, indeed, if you were a whole lot of people, with the coming of a big enough pie, all of that, ought to have vanished. Yet it turned out that slicing and tasting utilizing were problems that were intractable, not easy to straightforward to solve, problems that have flummoxed us, even though what people thought was the hard problem of growing a big enough economic pie, that we have managed to solve to an extraordinary degree. Thus, from one perspective, my slouching towards utopia is about how we solved the problem of baking the pie and how the other problems flummoxed us. And that is one reading of its big narrative sweep, albeit with lots of subthreads, digressions, and anecdotes along the way. Okay, so let me go back and let me say, why start, in 1870? Well, I assert that the level of technology, the value of the stock of useful human ideas about how to manipulate nature and productively organize ourselves, I assert that's proportional roughly to the average level of real income per capita over the world times the square root of population. Yes, output per worker also depends on the kind of capital output ratio, on the capital intensity of the economy. But, those fluctuations are relatively small, and on a worldwide scale, it's hard to say they drive a lot of it. And I assert we have good enough guesses to hand of world population. And we have not good enough guesses, but we have guesses of average real world income per capita, something like $11,600 in the prices of 2010 will be what the World Bank tells us it was in 2010. And then we have growth rates projected into the past, back to 1870, which give us $1,300 dollars per capita per year in real terms back in 1870. And this might be very wrong. This might be very wrong first because all of the projections past have embedded in them all the errors in estimating the growth rates. And so that means that 1870 for any one country may well be really, really off. We have to hope that the law of large numbers is helping us here. And also, practically all of our estimates are estimates of production at factor cost. And what we really want is the value of income, at user benefit. And maybe we can make the heroic leap and say that factor cost and user surplus are about roughly equal orders of magnitude when we have rival commodities. But as more and more of what we produce is information goods, or even goods for which the exact fit between the variety and the situation of the person is important, that rough rule of thumb tends to fall away, and you get people like Bill Nordhaus, who would say that if we say 1870 is 1300, then 2010 has to be much, much bigger. If 2010 is 11,600, 1870 has to be much smaller. And here we get the problem. That when we try to go back before 1870, we find from 1500 or before, it really does look like the world is in a fairly hard Malthusian equilibrium, with most people on the edge of what the World Bank would tell us is dire poverty, something like $2.50 a day, something like $900 per capita per year. And that seems to prevail from 1500 all the way back to the Neolithic Revolution, all the way back to minus 3000, the days when in Ur of the Chaldees, besides numbers and commodities, the most common written down sign was for female captive of foreign origin, with male captive of foreign origin being second. And then looking back before the Neolithic Revolution, we think we see a fitter, buffer population with perhaps more interesting cognitive dilemmas presented to them in daily life than the cognitive dilemmas presented day to day to the average farmer or weaver. Perhaps we see a Mesolithic society that is considerably better off, but I'm not going to go into that very interesting debate. And in between 1500 and 1870, well, we gotta interpolate. So we have estimates of total human population. We have estimates of average real income per capita. I assert that technology, the level of ideas deployed H, is proportional to average income per capita times the square root of population, normalized to the technology level at 1870 being 1. And why the square root? Well, if I just asserted that technology was the level of total income in the world, well, then I'd be asserting that raw labor is unproductive, that the 2 hands and 2 eyes in the brain and that loop in any aged person isn't really an addition to our productive potential. And if I asserted that it was just income per capita that was important, well, then I'd be asserting that resource scarcity was really not a thing. But resource scarcity is very much the thing. The square root between the power of 0 and 1 is a compromise. I cannot think of a better one. And so if I take that as my level of technology, and if I look at what happens to the growth rate of technology since a deep time, I find numbers that still strike me as amazing, and awe-dropping. I see a rise in the rate of growth of the deployed and diffused technology ideas stock from 0.9% per century around the year minus 6000 to 6% per century in the run-up. Between minus 1000 and the year 150 with the coming of classical antiquity. And you can say this is a combination of 2 heads are better than 1 and better communications technologies and also writing, which truly makes us an anthology intelligence, not from the perspective of the band or the village, but from the perspective of the globe, or at least of Eurasia plus Northern Africa as a whole. We see a society advancing towards better technology, better civilization, but still the improvements of technology between minus 1000 and 150, they're only supporting 12% per century of population growth. And if I'm right in saying standards of living are roughly constant, then if I'm right in the square root, That's still only a 6% improvement in technology per century. And then between 150 and 800, things simply seem to fall off a cliff. You can argue about real standards of living in 800 as opposed to 150 across Eurasia, at least. You can argue there was more income. There was more income inequality. You can argue there was better nutrition. There's certainly a lot less in the way of high culture and artifacts to make for middle class comfort. Take these numbers seriously, and we get the late antiquity, pause, the dark ages, a fall back in the average rate of technological progress. In the late Roman Empire, and with the collapse of the Han Empire, and with the invasions of Persia and India by whole bunches of barbarians who destroy a lot of high civilizations, a fall back to what was seen in the pre-literate early agrarian age days. Then between 800 and 1500, we have a recovery to rates of technological progress that are not be surprising to someone sitting in minus 500 BC. And after 1500, we get 3 watershed boundary crossings. The first being the coming of the imperial commercial age around 1500, with the Columbian Exchange doing an awful lot of the work of boosting the rate of technology growth from 5% per century up to 15% per century. Then we get the classic industrial revolution. And then around 1870, we get Simon Kuznetz's modern economic growth. Now, what do we make of the industrial revolution century? It's conventional saying that things were on the move with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, and that afterwards, the road to modernity was paved and easy to follow. I'm not so sure, right, that in the Industrial Revolution century, the proportional rate of growth of technology deployed and diffused into the world economy, it's less than 0.5% per year worldwide. And that's slow enough that a population growth rate of 1% per year would neutralize any impact of better technology on typical incomes. And, a poor world population can easily grow at that rate if you just reduce the amount of Malthusian nutritional stress a little bit. And a poor population, with a poor population, it's still the case that about 1 in 3 women will wind up not having surviving sons. And in a very poor, highly patriarchal world, in which about the only durable source of female social power, the source of much male social power as well, is having sons, Malthusian pressures still seem overwhelmingly strong, up to 1870. Plus, that 0.45% per year rate of growth of technology worldwide in the classic industrial revolution century, it's not necessarily stable. As Greg Clark, he keeps pointing out over and over and over again, you can only concentrate the manufacturing of the world in the most efficient industrial district once. You can only mine the really cheap surface coal where the last round of glaciers had scraped off all the post-Carboniferous rock off once. It is a possible counterfactual. William Stanley Jevons in his 1865, The Coal Question, was the first one to set it forward. A possible counterfactual in which post-1870 technological progress slows because its continuation along previous lines requires, a favorable coal abundance and cheapness, that is no longer there. A slowdown of, say, 1/3 in technological progress post-1870 compared to pre-1870, that would give us today the technology level we actually reached in 1890, but with a much bigger population than the world had in 1890, close to our own population, in fact, and thus a very poor world. People living not with the standard of living of 1890, but with the standard of living of 1883 on average. 7 million of us in greater San Francisco, but in a mid-Victorian. Such a persistent steampunk world is imaginable, but it is not ours, and many other than William Stanley Jevons were imagining it. That is, back when I first began thinking seriously about this book, I ran across this quote from the Final post-1870 edition of John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy. John Stuart Mill saw that steampunk future very clearly, saw that even the Industrial Revolution pace of technological progress was not coming close to the point of baking a big enough pie, and was not in any way on the way toward being solved. How did he think humanity could actually build a truly human world? Well, he wanted the state to impose child licenses on the poor, right? Unless you're middle class, you will not be allowed to reproduce. That's a hell of an oppression of individual liberty for someone who has a reputation as the great libertarian. But he did not see the possibility of a world in which people would choose to shift, as Oded Galore likes to say, from the more children to the more investment in a few children strategy. He did not see a world rich enough that infant mortality fell enough that women who wanted to have surviving sons could be guaranteed to have them. He thought the force of the state and mandatory deprivation of the lower class of its power to reproduce was something that would be required to create a truly human world. But he was wrong. We did in 1870 get a big shift, a big crossing of a watershed boundary. We had all the other pieces of the institutional complex all in place, but around 1870, we get the coming of the Industrial Research Lab to rationalize and routinize the creation, invention, and development of modern technologies to manipulate nature and organize humans. We get the modern corporation to rationalize and routinize the development and deployment of such technologies, and we get full globalization with the global build out of the railroad and the telegraph and the iron hull screw propelled ocean going steamship to make it extraordinarily profitable to deploy and then to diffuse by copying what others have deployed. That, someone like Nikola Tesla, right, who actually knew more about how to make electrons get up and dance than anyone else in the second half of the 19th century, who personally, because he was there and in the right spot, advanced electrification by 15 years, as he said things that struck all of his scientific peers as crazy. But he would have been absolutely no good without George Westinghouse willing to humor him and build an industrial research lab around him. And then without the Westinghouse Corporation being able to then take the ideas that discovered, developed, and deploy them. And the deployment wouldn't have happened without J.P. Morgan and George Fisher Baker able to finance the large corporation. And then modern globalization meant that everyone began copying AC power as fast and as soon as they could. And we were on our way to Robert Gordon's one big wave, to the second industrial revolution, to the great upward leap in the pace of growth of technology from the 0.45% per year that we saw from 1770 to 1870 deployed worldwide, to the 2%, more than 2% per year we've seen since 1870. And lo and behold, here we are. After 1870, the problem of baking a big enough pie was really on track to being solved. And in some ways, the solution, was straightforward. Just let the market economy rip, let the industrial research labs and the corporations do their thing in the context of the world market economy produced by full globalization. Everything else was there already. And, in the context of the market economy, which, as the genius Friedrich von Hayek most keen-sightedly observed, is tremendously effective at crowdsourcing solutions to problems that humanity can set it. Those proved keys to the lock that had kept humanity in its desperately poor iron cage, with the only comfortable ones being the thugs with spears who took from the near subsistence farmers and their accountants, propagandists, and bureaucrats. And so after 1870, we have previously unimaginable economic growth, revolutionizing the technologies of human life and doing so over and over again, generation by generation, in not just one episode of Schumpeterian creative destruction, but in repeated, never-ceasing episodes, 5 or so, if not more. That if you want to talk about the forces and relations of production and say that society has to be built on top of the base that is fundamentally the technology, and you want to say we have a technological revolution between the year 1000 feudal age and the 1870s steam power age, well, we've had between 3 and 5 such similar revolutions of equal magnitude since. And in each one of them, we have to remake society in order to take advantage and deploy the wealth created by these Schumpeterian creative destructions. And this is where our predecessors would have said that humanity, having dealt with the problem of baking a big enough pie, should have been able to turn to deal with the problems of slicing and of tasting and of utilizing it. Certainly it had resources to deal with these problems on a scale that was previously unthinkable. So how should we answer our predecessors? They would look at the extraordinary and amazing technological power of our civilization, power in which each of us is arguably richer than Nathan Mayer Rothschild was in the first half of the 19th century along the dimension that counts. Even though he was the richest man in the world in the first half of the 1800s, he died of an infected abscess in his butt because he was not rich enough to afford penicillin. And if you want to be really horrified, you should read the pages of Neil Ferguson's Rothschild group biography about the torture death of Nathan Mayer Rothschild at the hands of his doctors. They would say, why have you not created a utopia? Since you've solved the problem of baking enough and also removed all the additional causes of strife that arise because people fight when there isn't enough, they would be very surprised to see how the problems of slicing and tasting have managed to flummox us. Okay, so what happened? This, I think, my book really has nailed. Letting the market economy rip to solve the problem of making enough had consequences. The repeated sequential Schumpeterian creative destruction economic revolutions meant that all that was solid melted into air. All firmly established patterns and orders were steamed away, and men and women were not compelled to face with sober senses their real conditions of life and their relations with one another, but they did have to try to build new institutions on the fly to manage the problems of opportunities that production, distribution, and utilization that the onrushing technological cornucopia brought, because whatever running code to manage society you had in the previous generation, it would no longer work with the underlying transformation of the forces of production. Now, that idiot, Friedrich von Hayek, thought that the unleashed market would do the whole job, or at least would do all the job that could be done. If the market would produce enough, true, it could not produce social justice, but we should not ask for social justice. Why not? Because attempting to achieve social justice would undermine the market economy's ability to do what it could do and put us on the road to serfdom. The market giveth, the market taketh away, blessed be the name of the market, had to be our gospel. And, Karl Polanyi's whimpers that this wouldn't work, Hayek dismissed them. But as that genius Karl Polanyi put it in his book, The Great Transformation, Hayek's catalepsy was a stark utopia that people would not stand for. People would not stand empirically for being told that there are no rights but property rights. They insisted that the market was made for man, not man for the market, that the market's treating those whom society saw as equals unequally or unequals equally, that depriving those who did not have property rights of social power and voice, that brought social explosion after social explosion, blocking the road to utopia. And so there is this continued contest between the market economy and requirements that people have other forms of rights. And all the while off in the corner, we had John Maynard Keynes whimpering, saying, if only you will give my students, the technocrats, the ability to run monetary policy and also manage to achieve a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment. If only you will do that, then everyone will have a job. And because maintaining full employment will require very loose monetary policy, plutocracy will cease to be a problem. The rentiers will euthanize themselves. With interest rates very low, the only way that the super rich can exercise their social power is by spending down their capital, and then they cease to be the super rich. And so you will have a society with tolerable equality, but also with people rewarded according to perceived merit of how hard they work. And because everyone would have a job, the system would hang together. And it's with that trio, Friedrich von Hayek, Karl Polanyi, John Maynard Keynes off whimpering the corner, that I construct my grand narrative, that I construct this Karl Polanyi-ish frame for the book as a whole. And saying indeed that since 1870, humans of all kinds have tried to think of solutions, have dissented from the market giveth, have demanded the market do less, different, or other institutions more. Perhaps humanity did become close to an institutional societal setup to tackle the problems of slicing and tasting with post-World War II social democracy in the rich countries. But somehow social democracy failed its sustainability test and was replaced by neoliberalism, which stubbornly persists in spite of its failure to fulfill any of its promises except the one it would make much greater wealth inequality. And so the wheel has turned. Here we are now. Why are not the good people of the global north happier and more satisfied with the techno-utopian marvels that have been delivered to them? Why has great wealth and historical perspective produced not reduced, but even increased economic anxiety? And how does that get transformed into ethno-nationalist fear and rage? Our current situation in the rich countries, there is enough by any reasonable standard, and we are all unhappy, seeking earnestly to discover who the enemies are, who have somehow stolen our rich utopian birthright and fed us unappetizing lentil stew instead. So what do we do next? Well, it's conventional for such a book to have a last chapter saying what is to do next. I omit it on the grounds that if I put in the chapter, it will sound silly in a year and a half, or maybe even in 6 months. While if I omit it, I can write new versions of the chapter where it should go next every year for as long as I live. And so hopefully, if the book takes off, have a career. But I would say that what to do next is for a younger generation than my largely failed one to decide. We have, in addition to the 20th century problem of figuring out how to produce enough for utopia and then utilize it and distribute it, we have the 21st century problems, global warming, ethno-national terrorism on all sides, revived fascism, techno-kleptocracy. So let me give the last word to John Maynard Keynes about how, writing in 1924 against Trotsky, about how Trotsky assumes that a plan exists. But there doesn't. Hence, we do not need to even listen to and argue about whether we should try to join Trotsky's party and impose his solution. We need to first think very hard about what the solution might be. And let me note, I could have written a very different economic history of the 20th century. I could have written what I think of as the Michael Polanyi book, the David Landis book, the Joseph Schumpeter book, the John Maynard Keynes books. There are a whole bunch of reacting to Red Vienna books. The Karl Polanyi book I've written largely. There's a much more pro-Friedrich Hayek book. There's a Peter Drucker book. There's a Karl Popper book. There are others. But let me stop there because I've talked for more than long enough.
Not long enough for my appreciation, but we do need to continue with the rules of engagement of the seminar. So thank you very much, Brad. That's been a fantastic introduction to the book. To the audience, this is the moment where we do our job. We help Brad finesse his argument. And while you're collecting your thoughts and raising your electronic hands, let me start and ask you, a slightly different version of what you were saying at the very end. So you said that you omitted your last chapter because it was bound to become, out of no longer updated very quickly. But the question I wanted to ask you is, you start out by saying that you want to unapologetically introduce a new grand narrative, and for that you need to define a new time period, which you identify as this long 20th century from 1817 to 2010, right? Although you don't write that final chapter, you pointedly say that this long 20th century is gone, right? So we're on the cusp of something different, perhaps worse, perhaps better, depending what the new generation does. But I mean, the question then is, doesn't your story perhaps become too dependent on the end period, right? So imagine that you had written this book 10 years, right? There would still be the acceleration of growth from 1870 or productive ideas, the growth of the stock of productive ideas, as you put it in the book. But perhaps the end would be, or 20 years ago, right? So how robust your grand narrative
Well,
is.
I wrote a draft of chapter 2 back in 1998. And at that point, the book was going to be a left neoliberal triumphantist book. It was going to be that post-World War II social democracy had indeed failed its sustainability test because of over-bureaucratization, but that figuring out how to use social democratic or how to use market means to social democratic ends properly, turning back the challenge of right neoliberalism and replacing it with left neoliberalism, had in fact gotten the world into a groove in which we could hope finally for convergence in income levels along the world and in a more or less straightforward march to utopia, that the 20th century had slouched, the 21st century would stand tall and jog toward utopia. Then come 2004, the last chapter in my mind's eye was that, we had thought that the era of religious war was over. And thus that with the closing of the ideological frontier, a la Francis Fukuyama, that the world was going to be largely peaceful. And lo and behold, it turned out not to be true at all. That war, although over what? That Norman Engel was right back in 1907 when he began writing about how it's much cheaper to trade than to fight for virtually anything that you want. So that only an idiot tries to occupy and oppress someone else rather than offering them a trade. And hence great powers will sooner or later wake up to this. Lo and behold, not true in 2003. Not true today. And so in 2005, the book was not quite as left neoliberal triumphant. It was saying that the fight between left and right neoliberalism was still ongoing. And from right neoliberalism's perspective, income and wealth inequality was a feature rather than a bug. that the people who the market does not regard as worthy deserve to be poor. And combine that with the fact that we were still waging war against each other, that those made hopes that we would stride toward utopia in the 21st century, at the very least dicey, that we could not be confident. Then come 2010, and it appears that the great and good of the industrial core are very, very clear that the financial system needs to be rescued in the event of a major financial crisis and a threatened depression, but that reattaining full employment is in fact not a goal that we are going to prioritize. The lost half decade after 2008, any claims that that we actually know how to run a macroeconomy to make people's incomes secure and their lives stable are clearly false. After 2010, it becomes the kind of failure to slice and failure to properly slice and taste, failure to distribute and utilize wealth for good or for proper good, that this book ends with. And then around 2016, with the rise of neo-fascism, and it's not just Donald Trump, it's Bolsonaro. I see worrying signs in Mexico. It's Modi's version of national Hinduist India. It's Orban. It's Xi Jinping with his belief that he has a superior system. Instead of marrying von Hayek to Polanyi and blessing it by Keynes, he has married von Hayek to Lenin, and it is perhaps blessed by Master Kung. That those in the context of global warming and other very urgent 21st century problems coming down the pike make the end of the book even more shadow than I thought it would be back in 2012.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nathan, you're next.
All right. Very interesting talk. Let me go back not to the last chapter, but maybe to the earlier chapters, looking at the beginning. So do you see this kind of, cyclicality in this very long century, where the beginning, where you had this acceleration of growth and technology, was in an environment that was very, unregulated, no welfare state, no social democracy, right. Rising inequalities leads to this, the wars, the big wars, right. Fascism, etc. Then we have this kind of hiatus, and then we go back basically in many ways to the 1870s, and so I see this kind of a roller coaster instead of kind of a progression. And in that sense, what would you say about the future, given this kind of sort of cyclicality in these things, where market power, unleashed market power, as you said, firms doing their best research and all these monopolies that were doing all these innovations and research labs, rising inequality, financial development, financial debacles, fascism, and is it something we're kind of in this fast pace of growth? Is it something that we're doomed to experience every, say, 60 years or 50 years, or is there a way out of this and going to utopia the way you maybe Polanyi would lead us to?
Well, I think that if Karl Marx had been, say, a social scientist rather than a prophet, or maybe if Friedrich Engels had not come under the influence of Karl Marx as a prophet, I think they might well have wound up where you are, right? That there are forces of production. On top of those, there are relations of production, and then the political, sociological, ideological superstructure. And with changes in the forces of production, whatever running code for society you've managed to cobble together no longer holds on, and you have to remake institutions on the fly in a way that doesn't produce a social explosion. And sometimes you're going to fail. And when you fail, you then have an enormous period of chaos and disruption, followed by cobbling together a new running code to deal with the society with the new forces of production. And then, lo and behold, that institutional order ossifies, but the forces of production keep on changing, and then you need to adapt again or else. And then you would say we had a feudal system, but technology changed, and after the Columbian Exchange, we had the gunpowder empires. And then we moved from the gunpowder empires to the steam power age with an awful lot with French revolutions and Napoleonic wars and so forth. But, you know, whatever institutions you cobble together in the Victorian era for the steampunk age, you know, those that John Maynard Keynes in 1919 in The Economic Consequences of the Peace worked so incredibly well. Those have then under an enormous amount of stress before World War I, and the explosion comes when great powers and also military bureaucratic elites decide that what they really need is a short, victorious war. You get World War I as chaos. You get attempts to rebuild this old system after World War I, but it no longer works because you now have not a steam power forces of production underlying it, but you have rather second industrial revolution forces underlying it. You fail to rebuild it. You find that you've run into a Great Depression and that the attempts to build alternatives, you know, fascism and really existing socialism have their own problems. You have World War II, after which we're lucky enough to be able to pick up US New Deal institutions in the OECD and roll forward with 30 years, but then come 1970s, the system is once again out of whack. We get the desire for and the fact of the neoliberal turn, but whatever managed to make neoliberalism hold together as a hegemonic ideology and system of governance from 1980 to 2005 or so now appears to have broken down again. You could say we go from feudal to gunpowder empire to steam power to, you know, electricity, oil, chemicals, to mass production, to mass consumption, to global value chain, specific to global value chain differentiated production. And now we're headed into a, I don't want to call it an information and social media economy of weaponized interdependence. And each time the institutions that worked the previous 20 years before no longer work, and we have to figure out how to build new ones. That this is the cycle we are in as long as technological progress continues at anything like its modern economic growth Schumpeterian rate. And, you know, maybe things have finally slowed down somewhat. They certainly seem to have in the global north, although I reserve judgment as to whether that's just a horrible botch that was the response to the Great Recession. So that kind of, I could say Nathan Sussman is the new Marx, but instead of having feudalism, capitalism, socialism, we have a new mode of production every generation or so, which requires a new set of top-down or bottom-up social revolutions to deal with it.
Well, thanks. I mean, if I can just, I'm tempted to add just one sentence, but yeah, I mean, I completely agree, but I just trying to generalize some kind of theme of that the technological pace of technological evolution and development is much faster than the institutional one, and this creates kind of these kind of frictions that it's easier to develop technology than to develop institutions. That's kind of
or to figure out how institutions need to change when all of a sudden the technological underpinnings are very different. And yes, Schumpeterian process has created a lot, but it's also destroyed institutions, occupations, incomes, and communities, you know, and keeps doing so. And von Hayek would say we need the destruction because otherwise we freeze into bureaucratic stasis and are on the road to serfdom, you know, but nobody likes the fact that their income, their job, their ability to find a job, their community, their industry may suddenly vanish just because some rootless cosmopolite 5,000 miles away has decided that the fabric of their life no longer passes some maximum profitability test. And, the social democratic counter is that we'll have a lot of redistribution. That seems to make a lot of people very unhappy too, because if there's one thing we know about a program, about a social democratic redistribution program, somehow a lot of people think that other people are taking advantage of it and are being cheaters by getting it and are not wrong, and then that they shouldn't get their Obama phones or their whatever.
Thanks.
Gabriel Masovich, King College London, is next online. Gabriel, you can unmute yourself.
Thanks, Ree. Thanks, Brett. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the talk. Super fascinating. I wanted to ask you also, I guess, a question about periodization. And so I was thinking a bit when you were showing your H index and stuff about some of these debates around the Industrial Revolution, where they used to say, maybe the Industrial Revolution wasn't revolutionary because GDP doesn't really react in the short run. And so, of course, a lot of the changes.
Although population does react fairly substantially, and the concentration of industry certainly does react. It may well not be enough to push you over the hump of the demographic transition, but it does react.
So I guess what I'm getting at here is, it seems like you're sort of measuring something that's a bit like output for thinking about where you start. So, but, there could be substantial changes in, the way technology is being applied or the way institutions are structured or things like that. So, is it more sensible to think about our periodization for the 20th century in terms of, levels of output, or in terms of the way production is being organized? So, once growth starts to be at a high rate, living standards start changing very rapidly. So output changes really rapidly across the 20th century, right? So, wealth in the 1920s is probably higher than the 1870s, than the 1870s compared to the 1830s, et cetera. I know that all of these lines are probably with a fudge factor, but I was wondering how you thought about this.
Factors. I'm playing with the idea that we should actually talk more about modes of production, and perhaps even more so modes of domination, at least before 1870 or so. And there, right? 1770 to 1870, with that Bob Allen at practically every opportunity shows up with his graph of the relative world concentration of manufacturing, which is just completely gonzo, the process that starts after 1770 of the relative concentration of manufacturing, in what's originally a circle of 300 miles around the English port of Dover. And then its offshoots in New England and the American and Canadian Midwest and elsewhere. That huge shifts in patterns of trade and specialization that are powerful enough or that are profitable enough for the market economy to produce them, but don't show up in average real GDP statistics. Just as there's a very nice book by non-economic historian Patrick Wyman called The Verge, about just how is it that all of these very small European monarchies are able to punch well above their weight around 1500. And the answer is that the other powers, the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Ming, are the Safavids there yet? That they basically have to rule through command and bureaucracy. But that European kingdoms, even in the early 1500s, can rule through finance and through the market. And by offering a relatively small amount of wealth to strategic actors like the Fuggers or the Genoese or so forth, the Kingdom of Castile, that has absolutely no business conquering the Americas, can assemble the resources to do so out of a combination of European finance and Genoese technology, naval technology, and papal blessings and so forth, that you're constructing all kinds of flexible institutions on the fly to accomplish purposes both tremendously good and tremendously evil, in a way that other more bureaucratic, more sclerotic, less flexible societies more focused on actually maintaining the force and fraud, exploitation, and extraction machine at home, simply cannot do. That I think would be a wonderful thing to write and think about. And then there's the question of how many modes of production actually do we have after 1870, which is another one, and one I've been playing with for a while.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. But we need to introduce a formal stop here because this is the end. So I'd like to thank all the audience for showing up today.
And let me thank the audience as well for coming to listen. Let me hope you buy and enjoy the book and find it useful, and that your students find it useful as well. I can't write a book like this and be right even 80% of the time, right? At least 20% of this book is big time wrong. And I want you all to tell me where it is and write it better. Because we really should have a grand narrative for thinking about global economic history, in part as it informs the current situation, that is more than just, there was the Industrial Revolution and, now we're a rich industrial society. We need something more textured. And I would say more 1870 as the hinge focus, but we can disagree about that. And, I'm getting old and I don't have the brain I had 20 years ago. So I'm not going to be able to do that much longer or even very well right now. So it's up to you.
Okay, so on that appeal for crowdsource, I would like to thank you again and remind you that we will continue not next week because we changed the periodicity. So we'll reconvene 2 weeks from now on the 14th of September to hear Paolo Giuliano and Marco Tabellini talk about the systems of ideology, historical immigration, and political preferences in the United States. Now, this is the end of the formal seminar, but not the actual end of our meeting today. We still have about 10 minutes to go, 15 minutes to go. And there's one question on the queue. This is by Angie Reddish. Angie, I'm going to...
Oh, excellent. All right.
And you can ask your question. There you are. Go ahead.
Okay, can you hear?
Yes. You're coming through loud and clear.
Thanks. I really enjoyed this, and I enjoyed the sort of sharp dichotomy between you've got the goods, you got to produce the goods, you got to distribute the goods. It's very clean. Yes. The question I had to do with China, and the way that I thought about it was, at first was, if you were in China, would you have written this book as a scholar? Of course, that brings a whole bunch of other things. So then I thought, if Brown had been working in China for the last 20 years, would you have written the same book?
Well, actually, 2 weeks ago, Yingyi Qian came through Berkeley, who has been working in China for the past 20 years. And his view was that first, the book is really inadequate because from the perspective of 2100, the hinge will not be 1870, the hinge will be 1975 or so, when the kind of socialist wave, whether really existing socialism in the Brezhnevite vein or ideological mobilization in the Maoist vein, or even the License Raj and the British Labour Party - Nehru dynasty vein, when that begins to ebb, from kind of Asia. That the coming of the neoliberal age, the coming of Deng Xiaoping in 1976, of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, of Ronald Reagan in 1981, and of Rajiv Gandhi in 1986, and their deployments of broadly neoliberal governance structures that has produced the enormous boom in Asia, and that has been somewhat fumbled by the global north, that's going to read as the moment in which things were really, really transformed. Much more than, just this one small peninsula plus its offset in North America manages to get to industrial civilization. He also said that one of my problems is I'm basically a social democrat, and so I really do not understand why social democracy failed its sustainability test in the 1970s and want to try it again, and that blocks the book as well. And then there is whether or not China's currently institutional structure, which, as I was saying, looks like von Hayek married to Lenin, blessed by Master Kung, whether that is in some sense sustainable. Certainly Xi Jinping thinks it is, and he's going to stay in office as long as he lives in order to try to make it so.
Yep, thank you.
All right, anyone else? We still have 10 minutes while we wait. So let me go back to Nathan's question, but from a very different angle, more self-referential one. So I think it was in the late 1920s, actually I can check it online, 1927, Julien Benda, French, not very well known,
Yes.
Intellectual, wrote
The
this book
revolt
about
of the yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
the treason of the
The
intellectuals.
treason of the clerks.
Exactly.
The treason of the clerks. Yes.
Right. Now, can we? And essentially, what he was saying is that many European intellectuals that sold themselves to the the evil devil of nationalism, and that was one of the reasons, perhaps, why Europe is going down the drain. So recently, Anne Applebaum wrote a similar book, even more self-referential, right? The Twilight of Democracy, where she faults many, I guess you would call them right-wing neoliberals, for becoming very quickly disenchanted with what you could do with democratic institutions and going over to the full authoritarian right wing. So my question, I guess, where I'm trying to get is whether there's also, it's not only that institutions take longer to build and adapt to economic and technological transformations, but also not necessarily ideas, perhaps ideologies also have trouble being recycled in a way that are useful to society to adapt to those transformations. And perhaps, the fault is with researchers and intellectuals that are not able to actually adapt themselves and keep on just going back. As your last quote from Keynes says, keep going back to bad ideas. I think Keynes also has this other citation, right? The problem is not to come up with new ideas, is to, break free from the old ones.
I mean, I'm reminded of Austrian socialist leader Victor Adler in 1914 saying, "Yes, I know we all promised a general strike and the convening of a peace conference if the great powers threatened war, but the workers of Vienna are out there demanding that we militarily punish the Serbs and the Russians. And it's better to be wrong with the working class than right against them." And there's a pun, then you have Mussolini with his, "I want to be a political player. I want to be the leader of a mass movement. I would like the mass movement to be transformative. I'm a good socialist. I, in fact, stuck by my pacifism for a year and a half after most of the rest of the Italian Socialist Party began calling for an invasion of Austria in order to conquer the Alto Adige from Italy, a province where I say, I would still believe the dominant political party is called the Südtirol Volksbund, even to this day. That I'm going to switch. If ethno-nationalism rather than socialism mobilizes the masses, I'm going to become an ethno-nationalist. And look, I mean, Anne Applebaum is, I think, quite rightly horrified at the reactions of many of those who she thought were her friends, her allies, and her peers. how one deals with this, how one deals with the fact that it is indeed seems to be, much, much easier to terrify people that internal and external enemies who are other than they are coming for them. And thus we need to rally around, some leader who will tell us where to go and what to do with we as a community of fictitious dissent. That the strength of that is kind of terrifying. And, you add to that the fact that as Recline worries that perhaps in a post-Gutenberg age of video and social media, it's a lot harder to run a politics of consensus, in which the center right says we have a good common home here, we need to fix the leaks in the roof, while the center left says we have a good common home here, we need this new addition to put on. And instead, it all becomes the business of who are your enemies and will you protect me from the enemies? Which is further strengthened from the fact that we now have a lot of the best minds in America focused on how you can scare the shit out of people so that their eyeballs are glued to screens so they can be sold fake diabetes cures and fraudulent crypto scams. That it's one thing to have a Mussolini parroting fascist propaganda for his own political power and what he thinks at some level is the greatness of Italy as a unified people. It's quite another to have Facebook egging on such people and promoting them and sending their messages viral just because it wants to sell advertisements. It's a very strange situation. And once again, as Nathan would say, our ability to construct a proper sociological shell around in this case, the technology's production of information technology is a huge problem.
Thanks. The last question is going to Joachim Buch. Joachim, you can unmute yourself and ask your question, but please be brief because we're coming to the end of our time. Thank you.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was a good segue too, because I wanted to ask sort of the social media question, but over the full history, right? So I was very interested in the things that you said about institutions and like the codes that we run having to be updated by every major change.
Oops, I suddenly think we've lost Joachim.
Oh no.
Joachim, I didn't lose him. Could you please start again?
Okay, so I was very interested in the changes of institutions and what you mentioned about social media. I don't know, can Brad still hear me?
Yeah. I think I lost
you for about 30 seconds there, but now my machine is back.
Yeah.
Or now my Comcast is back.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask, so the question is, don't we learn?
Yeah. That I don't know what I tend to think of this as channeling Horkheimer and Adorno, right? That we have this enlightenment and it creates these technologies of knowledge and communication, and they all go horribly wrong for reasons we do not understand. In that things that are supposed to allow people to talk and communicate with each other in some kind of, ideal speech situation, public sphere. Instead, we have some kind of madman Bavario-Austrian corporal on the radio convincing huge numbers of people that the, Jewish Slavic Bolsheviks are coming for them all, and we are coming for us all, and we need to attack them in self-defense first. And that this worry that the idea that our social media technologies, especially our social media technologies, in the service of right-wing movements based on plutocracy that are desperately anxious to distract people's attention from economic inequality into other potential cleavages, is extremely dangerous. And I would say, yes. You know, that Francis Fukuyama's major thing he got wrong in his End of History was that he thought that fascism, as we had known it, was over in the rubble of Berlin in 1945, and it quite plainly is not. And maybe you can say that, you know, this has long been a form of human organization going back to Napoleon the Great or even before, that we need to figure out how to deal with, and we don't. But at this point, I simply want to throw the question over the wall to somebody else who is more qualified. You know, some combination of information theorist and, you know, Frankfurt School descendant and devotee, for which my principal candidate right now is, I think, Zeynep Tufekci at Columbia, who I think is writing the best things about the infosphere in the 21st century right now.
Right. Thank you very much, Brad. Thanks everyone again who stayed for the extra 15 minutes. As you know, Brad is very open to hear from you once you read the book or before. So it's very easily Googleable. So it's very easy to reach. And on that note, unfortunately, we need to stop today. But we look forward to see you again virtually or in person in future interactions. Till then, keep well.
But negative critical reviews are what I want. It's the only way I'm going to learn anything.
All right.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
High-powered incentives then. All right.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, Brad. Bye-bye.